You can't enter. Make an appointment or send an email instead. These words, spoken by French security guards to President Ibrahim Traoré, cost France its embassy in Burkina Faso in a single afternoon. What happens when African leaders stop accepting disrespect from former colonial powers? The closure of the French embassy in Ouagadougou has sparked celebrations across the country and sent ripples throughout the continent, marking a dramatic shift in power dynamics that had remained unchanged for decades. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. When Burkina Faso gained independence from France in 1960, the celebration masked a complex reality. The French flag came down, but French influence remained firmly in place through a system known as Francafrique. This network of political, economic, and military relationships allowed France to maintain substantial control over its former colonies while presenting the appearance of respecting their sovereignty. France established this post-colonial control through several effective mechanisms. They positioned military bases across the region, maintained privileged access to natural resources, and installed monetary systems that kept economies tied to French interests. In Burkina Faso, as in other former colonies, France retained significant influence over government decisions through both official diplomatic channels and unofficial pressure. The relationship operated under a contradictory framework. Public statements from French officials spoke of partnership and mutual respect, while behind closed doors, France protected its economic interests and strategic position. French companies dominated key sectors in Burkina Faso's economy, from mining to telecommunications and infrastructure development. This economic dominance translated directly into political influence, allowing France to shape policies that favored its national interests. For decades, this arrangement continued with minimal resistance. However, the security situation in the Sahel region, including Burkina Faso, began deteriorating dramatically in the 2010s with the rise of jihadist groups and increased violence. Despite the presence of French troops under Operation Barkhane, violence against civilians increased year after year. This created a growing disconnect. French soldiers were on Burkinabe soil, yet security conditions worsened steadily. By 2022, public frustration reached a boiling point. Protesters regularly filled the streets of Ouagadougou, questioning why French military presence failed to improve security. Demonstrators carried signs demanding France out and accusing the former colonial power of ineffectiveness against rebel forces. Some even suggested that France secretly supported the very groups they claimed to fight, though evidence for this remained limited. This frustration provided fertile ground for political change. In September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré led a coup against the existing military government of Paul-Henri Damiba. At just 34 years old, Traoré represented a younger generation of military officers impatient with both domestic leadership and foreign intervention that produced few results. From his earliest days in power, Traoré signaled a different approach to relations with France. He openly questioned the value of French military assistance and suggested Burkina Faso might seek new partnerships, including with Russia. This potential pivot alarmed French officials, who saw their influence in the region eroding rapidly as similar anti-French sentiment spread across Mali, Niger, and other Sahel nations. French economic interests in Burkina Faso remained substantial, though precise figures rarely entered public discussion. The country's gold mining sector, where French companies maintained significant positions, represented a particularly important economic connection. Mining concessions, infrastructure contracts, and telecommunications agreements collectively gave France leverage over Burkina Faso's development path and economic decisions. The anti-French sentiment in Burkina Faso wasn't occurring in isolation. Across the Sahel region, similar movements gained momentum. In neighboring Mali, the government had already suspended French media outlets, including Radio France Internationale, RFI, and France 24, accusing them of broadcasting false information about alleged human rights abuses by Malian soldiers. This regional pattern suggested a fundamental shift in how former French colonies viewed their relationship with Paris. Initially, Traoré attempted conventional diplomatic approaches to assert Burkina Faso's sovereignty. In January 2023, his government formally demanded the departure of French troops stationed in the country, proposing a withdrawal timeline of just 4 weeks. This direct challenge to French military presence marked an escalation in tensions, but remained within established diplomatic channels. As months passed, the relationship continued deteriorating. Burkina Faso followed Mali's example by restricting French media access. Public protests against French presence became more frequent and vocal, with thousands gathering in Ouagadougou to demand complete French withdrawal. The frustration extended beyond government circles into widespread public sentiment. By mid-2023, the Franco-Burkinabe relationship had reached a breaking point. French diplomats found themselves increasingly isolated, their influence diminished, and their access to government officials limited. The decades-old system of French influence appeared to be collapsing under the weight of public discontent and a new generation of leaders unwilling to accept the established power dynamics. The embassy incident didn't occur in a vacuum, but against this backdrop of deteriorating relations and growing assertiveness from Burkinabe leadership. When Traoré decided to visit the French embassy personally, he did so as the representative of a population increasingly confident in demanding respect from its former colonial ruler. The symbolic significance of a president personally confronting French representatives resonated deeply with citizens tired of perceived disrespect and ineffective foreign presence. But what exactly happened when President Traoré decided to visit the French embassy himself? On a quiet morning in early 2023, President Ibrahim Traoré approached the French embassy in Ouagadougou without ceremony. There were no sirens, no motorcade, no security detail, just the president himself walking up to the gates of the diplomatic compound with purpose. This unassuming approach matched Traoré's leadership style, one that emphasized humility while representing the Burkinabe people. But his modest appearance obscured the gravity of his mission, to personally deliver sensitive intelligence directly to the French ambassador. The intelligence concerned French military activities within Burkina Faso's borders, information that Traoré considered too sensitive to transmit through regular diplomatic channels. Rather than send a representative or communicate through traditional means, the president decided that this matter required face-to-face discussion with the ambassador. It was a deliberate choice that emphasized the seriousness of the situation and asserted his authority as head of state. As Traoré approached the embassy gate, 2 French security guards intercepted him. Without requesting identification or offering any customary respect, they immediately denied him entry. One guard, described as tall and pale-skinned, addressed him directly. "No entry, this building is not for street visitors, go around, make an appointment." Traoré calmly explained that he had an important message for the ambassador. The guard's response was dismissive. "Then use email, this is not a market." The second guard added with clear sarcasm, "Unless you're bringing lunch or a delivery, move along." Neither guard made any attempt to verify the visitor's identity, treating the president of Burkina Faso as an unwelcome intruder at the gates. This interaction revealed profound power dynamics at work. The guards, representatives of the former colonial power, felt entitled to dismiss a head of state without basic courtesy. Their suggestion that a president should make an appointment or use email to communicate with an ambassador stationed in his own country demonstrated an inverted understanding of diplomatic protocol. In effect, they were treating Traoré's country as if it were still a colony, where French representatives held higher status than local leadership. The president's response to this treatment spoke volumes about his character and strategic thinking. Rather than causing a scene or immediately identifying himself, Traoré remained composed. He simply pulled out his phone and made a brief call. "It's me, they denied me entry, you know what to do." These calm words, delivered without raising his voice or invoking his title, set in motion a sequence of events that would fundamentally alter Franco-Burkinabe relations. Inside the embassy, chaos erupted when officials realized their mistake. A senior French diplomat rushed from the main building, visibly disturbed, demanding to know who had been turned away. Learning it was President Traoré himself, the official's face drained of color. Ambassador Jean-Pierre Martel reportedly stormed down a hallway, his tie askew, exclaiming in disbelief, "You let the President of the Republic walk away from his own embassy." The realization of the diplomatic catastrophe had clearly set in. Meanwhile, Traore's brief phone call had activated Burkina Faso's military response. Within 15 minutes, 3 military trucks arrived outside the embassy gates. Soldiers in full uniform lined up silently, creating a perimeter around the diplomatic compound. They made no aggressive moves, they didn't speak or aim their weapons, but their silent presence communicated clear intent. The embassy, which moments before had denied entry to Burkina Faso's president, now found itself surrounded by Burkinabe forces. What happened next surprised both the French officials and international observers. Traoré issued an official order to close the French embassy, effective immediately. The order bypassed normal diplomatic procedures, which typically involve a gradual scaling back of relations. Instead, it represented an immediate and total response to the disrespect shown by embassy staff. The French diplomatic mission was given a short window to evacuate, and formal diplomatic relations were suspended. The entire sequence, from Traoré's arrival to the embassy closure, unfolded with remarkable speed. A routine morning had transformed into a historic turning point in Burkina Faso's post-colonial relationship with France. The incident demonstrated how a seemingly minor interaction, guards failing to recognize or respect a head of state, could trigger consequences that reshuffled regional power dynamics. Traoré's decision to close the embassy wasn't merely a reaction to personal offense. It represented a calculated response to years of accumulated frustration with French presence and influence. The guards' dismissive treatment provided the perfect catalyst for action that many Burkina-Faso citizens had wanted for years, a decisive break from French control. By ordering the embassy's closure, Traoré transformed a moment of disrespect into a declaration of sovereignty. As word spread of what had happened, the Burkinabe people's response was immediate and overwhelming. News of the embassy closure spread quickly through Ouagadougou's neighborhoods. Crowds began to gather near the embassy compound, not in protest but in quiet celebration. People stood together, watching as French officials hurriedly packed their belongings and prepared to leave. The atmosphere held a sense of dignity rather than chaos. This wasn't a violent uprising, but a moment of national pride. Citizens nodded to each other, exchanged knowing glances, and occasionally broke into spontaneous singing. For many Burkinabe people, this marked the first time they had witnessed their government take such direct action against perceived disrespect from the former colonial power. Meanwhile, inside what remained of the French diplomatic mission, officials scrambled to understand what had happened and how to respond. Emergency calls to Paris created a diplomatic crisis as officials attempted to salvage the situation. The French Foreign Ministry issued carefully worded statements expressing concern over the misunderstanding, but these attempts at damage control failed to match the momentum of events on the ground. The rapid evacuation of embassy staff proceeded under the watchful eyes of Burkinabe military forces, who maintained their silent perimeter around the compound. The story traveled far beyond Burkina Faso's borders through social media. Within hours, videos capturing Traoré's interaction with the guards, the arrival of military forces, and the embassy's closure spread across West Africa and beyond. One particularly powerful image showed the president walking away from the embassy gates, his posture straight and dignified despite the rejection he had faced. This image was shared thousands of times with captions emphasizing the significance of the moment, an African leader refusing to accept disrespect on his own soil. As the story spread, a teacher in a nearby school pinned a photo of Traoré walking away from the embassy to the blackboard with the words, "Power is not in shouting, it is in knowing when to walk and when to close the door behind you." This simple classroom display captured the emotional impact of the incident. It wasn't just a diplomatic spat, but a lesson in leadership and self-respect that resonated across generations. Leaders from neighboring countries watched the situation with intense interest. Though they avoided direct public statements that might complicate their own diplomatic relationships, private communications expressed solidarity with Traoré's position. In Mali, which had already experienced its own tensions with France, government officials monitored the situation closely, recognizing that events in Burkina Faso might create precedent for their own diplomatic approach. Niger, Chad, and other Sahel nations similarly observed how France would respond to this direct challenge to its diplomatic status. The practical consequences of the embassy closure took effect immediately. French diplomats left the country under military escort, Diplomatic relations entered an indefinite suspension, and communication between the two governments shifted to third-party intermediaries. French businesses operating in Burkina Faso faced uncertainty about their continued presence, and French citizens living in the country received advisories about potential security concerns. The economic and political relationship built over decades entered a period of profound uncertainty. As French influence diminished, other international actors moved to fill the vacuum. Russia, in particular, sought to strengthen its relationship with Burkina Faso. In the weeks following the embassy closure, discussions about expanded military cooperation between the two countries accelerated. Some demonstrators in Ouagadougou openly expressed support for Russian involvement, waving Russian flags alongside Burkinabe ones. The potential arrival of Russian military contractors from the Wagner Group represented a significant shift in the security partnerships in the region. The embassy incident prompted leaders across Africa to reassess their own relationships with former colonial powers. The traditional diplomatic protocols that had governed these relationships since independence suddenly appeared less fixed and more negotiable. Several countries began reviewing their security agreements, economic partnerships, and diplomatic arrangements with European nations. The question became not whether to maintain these relationships, but on what terms they should continue. For many observers, the embassy closure represented more than a single diplomatic incident. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how African nations engaged with former colonial powers. The episode demonstrated that respect and sovereignty couldn't be taken for granted, but sometimes needed to be asserted through direct action. As a symbol, the closed embassy building stood for a new approach to international relations, one based on mutual respect rather than historical patterns of deference. The emotional impact of the incident lasted far longer than the practical consequences. Citizens spoke of the embassy closure as a moment of national reawakening, a demonstration that Burkina Faso could determine its own path forward. African commentators described it as evidence that Africa has changed and that leadership is not defined by appearances, but by protecting national dignity. But beyond the immediate celebration, what did this moment truly represent for Burkina Faso and Africa? The French embassy in Ouagadougou now stands empty, a physical reminder of a moment when Burkina Faso demanded respect rather than requesting it. This building represents a fundamental change in how African nations engage with former colonial powers. As France's influence diminishes across the Sahel, leaders like Traore demonstrate that decisive action matters more than diplomatic protocol. This new approach to leadership prioritizes national dignity over historical deference. The embassy closure raises important questions for both sides. Will this lead to more equal relationships between African nations and former colonial powers? Or will it result in complete separation? The answer will shape regional politics for years to come.